Los Mesteños is a book I picked up about 6 years ago while I was studying to be a historian at the Air Force Academy. I chose to read this book to you today because this is one of the deepest dives into the Spanish ranching system in early Texas. This author, Jack Johnson, this historian, does more work and more justice to the vaqueros of old than virtually any other author that I know of. Without any further ado, let's jump into the video. It is deeply to be regretted that those venerable Spanish archives could not have been preserved and protected alike from ignorant, wanton vandalism and the marauding speculator. The loss from these sources of destruction to the early history of our state will never be fully appreciated. The fragments left serve only to admonish us that it has been great and irreparable. Abner S. Lipscomb, Texas, Supreme Court Justice, writing in Lewis v. San Antonio, 1851. Chapter 1. The Coming of the Cattle. By 1775, Texas was teeming with cattle and horses, most of which were unbranded and roaming in a semi-wild state. To avoid confusion, Spanish stockmen used several different terms to distinguish the animals, according to the relative states of wildness. Manso, or ganado vacuno, bovine animal, referred to gentle or tame stock, animals that were manageable and under control. Alzado referred to domestic stock that had strayed, run off, gone wild, and was living in a wild state. Orellano meant stock without a mark on the ear, oreja, or anywhere else, hence unmarked and unbranded. Mostrenco was used to describe cattle with no known owner, property either abandoned or lost. When found, it had to be exhibited so that the rightful owner would have an opportunity to claim it legally. In this sense, Mostrenco stock was different from vacant property or that which was totally wild and ownerless. It was the type of stray that later Texas stockmen called maverick. The term cimarron was given to stock that had run off and returned to nature. Practically speaking, it meant stock that was too wild ever to be effectively tamed and handled. The term was also used to describe runaway slaves. Cimarrones were the 𝗟𝗘𝗧'𝗦, in a class with bison and other beasts of the field. J. Frank Dobie's writings sometimes refer to these sly outlaws as ladrinos. To encompass all these fine distinctions, the Spaniards often use the term mesteño, from which is derived the English mustang. It was a broad expression, meaning wild and without owner, that is ownerless. True to its later usage, the Spaniards often had equine stock in mind when speaking of mesteños, whereas orellanos indicated bovine stock, yet one occasionally finds the terms used interchangeably. Thus, alzado, orellano, y mostrenco meant stray, unbranded, and ownerless. But mesteño implied all three. It was these mesteños, equine and bovine, that proved to be so troublesome in the 18th century Texas. In the first half of the 18th century, the missions of Texas, not the military or civilian elements of colonial society, conducted most of the stock raising carried out in the new land. One of the many reasons why Franciscan missionaries and other Indian herdsmen were initially involved with this frontier institution has to do with the nature of Spain's presence in Texas. The Spaniards came because the French in Louisiana were threatening their proprietary interest in Texas, and if they did not establish some sort of solid claim to the region, they stood to lose it. Thus the Spaniards marched northward and planted a few log bastions opposite the French in distant Nuevas Filipinas, an early name for Texas, essentially as a military maneuver. These expeditions were invariably accompanied by priests, if not instigated by them. The missionaries ventured into this uncharted wilderness, seeking new converts for the Holy Church, and their missions sprang up besides the seedy presidios. In the years to come, when all other reasons for penetrating and remaining in Texas failed, it was always the French menace that set things in motion. Once the entradas clanged to a halt, the Franciscan padres were the ones who made sure the animals that were brought along received care and multiplied. One of the more interesting stories I found in this book comes when, in 1731, 16 families at Crown expense from the Canary Islands showed up in this area of the world. Johnson says, they were mostly peasant folk, farmers, fishermen, and laborers, unaccustomed to stock raising from horseback on a New World scale. Upon their departure overland from 𝗟𝗘𝗧, each of these 56 immigrants was issued 2 horses, a saddle, bridle, spurs, and other accoutrements, and the group was allotted 6 men at 1 peso a day to care for these animals, including the saddling and unsaddling. Despite such precautions, the 𝗖𝗍𝗧 made a poor showing with the horseflesh His Majesty had bestowed upon them. A report filed on March 12, 1731, 3 days after their arrival at Bexar, by Captain Juan Antonio Perez de Almazan, claims that they reached their destination with 128 horses, 77 pack mules, and 32 oxen. This, it was noted, was fewer than the 142 caballos they had started with, not to mention those issued at Saltillo by Matias Aguirre and obtained at other places along the way. Altogether, 125 horses perished from fatigue on the journey. Like other observers, the captain of San Antonio commented unfavorably on the immigrants' equestrian skills and said that they were totally ignorant of horse gear, useless in mounted warfare, as it had evolved on the frontier. Presumably, this also applied to the tending of livestock from horseback. These 𝗖𝗍𝗧 then had to struggle with the Apaches, the Comanches, and also assimilating into the current culture that was already established in this area of Texas and Mexico. These 𝗖𝗍𝗧 would go on to basically become farmers. And what ended up happening was the missionaries and their herds would bust into the 𝗖𝗍𝗧's crops, and these livestock would just destroy everything. And when the 𝗖𝗍𝗧s brought this up to the administration basically told them that it wasn't that big of a deal and to get on with their lives. The remainder of the chapter is rife with different conflicts between the herds and farmers. And the government in this area of the country wanted to create peace, but ultimately they failed in doing so, and the farmers and ranchers clashed. This is something that we would see later in the United States in the 1870s between the grangers and the ranchers. While the United States sided with the farmers in the 1800s, allowing people to homestead and to break up the land, the Spanish took the opposite route. They sided more with the ranchers and with the herds. This meant that the Spanish would maintain almost an aristocracy around the people that were herding, because only one man could own so much of the herd. Instead of breaking up the land and farming, the Spanish went the route of giving a single person massive amounts of land, which ensured that only the top 1% of this culture would ever get rich. In regards to the mission system, where the Padres were taking care of the wild herds, Jack Johnson has this to say: the settlers were also convinced of their right to the wild stock. Although at times greed would seem to motivate their claims, they were sincere in believing, as did their Anglo counterparts who were beginning to push inland from the Atlantic seaboard, that nature's bounty belonged to those bold enough to seize it. They were men of action and saw languor reigning over the wealth constituted by the wild beasts. To them the Padres could not utilize the Mesteños, even if they so desired. Consequently, there was no harm in seeking to exploit the situation and put the widespread herds to good use. 𝗟𝗘𝗧 no doubt favored the individual rancher's point of view, being one himself. He also believed that isolated bastions, scattered in the vast land and maintained at crown expense, were not the answer to frontier defense. It was the citizenry, not the military, that he envisioned as the ultimate means whereby the land, like its Indians, would be reduced. Thus he welcomed the northward march of ranchers seeking new places to pasture their stock, realizing that men will fight to protect such things. It is difficult to imagine Don Jose de Escandon accepting the viceroy's ruling on Alzado's stock around the Mission San Juan with anything but favor, offering as it did rewards to militant and aggressive stockmen. The following takes place on Mexican missions in the 1700s. This comes from Los Mesteños, written by Jack Johnson. The month of October and November was occupied with the annual branding. All who could go are sent to herd the cattle in the mission pasture and brand the unbranded cattle. It was customary to inform other missions and residents of the presidio so that they could separate their cattle from the rest. In Concepcion's missionaries cooperated in similar fashion when it was their turn to brand. This at least was the way it was supposed to work. Saddle making was carried on at Mission Concepcion, an activity that, according to the instructions, was reserved to non-Indians. The work of making saddles in all the missions is always done by a Spaniard. When I say Spaniard, I mean a non-Indian. This is the usage here. This task, like some others that the Indians cannot perform or are not able to perform with fidelity and with the necessary requirements, made the presence of a few Spanish servants or non-Indians very necessary at the mission. They were also preferred as shepherds, but since so few Spaniards were available, the priest was forced to appoint Indians. Saddle makers were given a certain amount of corn and meat each month, suggesting that the 𝗖𝗢𝗧, or saddles, ridden by Mission Vaqueros were not of the best quality. Unfortunately, no specimens survive, except for several crudely executed saddle trees of undetermined vintage. Besides the horse gear produced locally, some was obtained through the supply system of the religious colleges. An invoice from the final decade of the century lists the following articles destined for the San Antonio and Bahia missions at wholesale prices: 24 pairs of leather saddlebags at 14 reales each, 8 leather riggings and saddle trees at 7 pesos each, 6 leather saddle coverings and rump housings at 4 pesos each, 12 pairs of protective leather skirts at 4 pesos, 3 dozen saddle pads, 18 reales, 44 dozen lazos at 2 reales each, and 49 ropes, known as riadas, probably woven rawhide at 2 pesos each. The single bed freno, with silver adorned bridle in the shipment, cost a staggering 15 pesos. Thus it can be seen that properly outfitting a vaquero, even on a mission Indian scale, was a fairly expensive proposition. Descriptions of other functions likely carried on at the Texas missions, curing hides for leather, packing 𝗖𝗢𝗡𝗡𝗖𝗧 and tallow, drying meat, and so on, are harder to come by. Ranchers at Bexar later stated that their herds were scattered because of the many hunting expeditions carried on to take fat, 𝗖𝗢𝗡, and hides, indicating that such activities were widely pursued. The cattle fled hunting parties and turned even wilder, becoming more widely scattered than before. The more slaughters, the smarter the herds became at evading them. The meat taken in hunts was dried, and all these products were carried to distant markets since before 1774. It was not considered profitable to make cattle drives to other provinces, according to the Spanish missionaries. If the 2 mission ranches near the coast conducted a hide and tallow trade, as the California missions did in the early 19th century, its extent is presently only guessed at. records from the Papales de Cuba or account books kept by the missionaries, which were eventually housed in their respective college conventos, may reveal something on the subject. Then in 1762, somebody made a report on what the ranch houses were like on these missions. This report of 1762, or rather collection of reports, one from each resident minister, provides us our best glimpse of the mission ranchos. Baleros was some distance from the mission compound, presumably down at La Mora by the time. Thus for protection it had a stone house and a stone chapel to accommodate the cowboys, shepherds, and possibly their families who lived on the site. The ranch house had 3 rooms with an arched portal. The structure was 24 varas, about 67 feet long, and the chapel was 11 varas, about 30 feet long. Inside the chapel was an altar with a stone cross 5.5 feet tall, along with 2 sets of vestments for the celebration of Mass. Most likely the chapel, like the one upriver at Las Cabras, was visited irregularly by priests traveling along the river road from 𝗟𝗧𝗧 to La Bahia. The road originally lay below the river, but in 1755 Captain Manuel Ramirez de la Piscina scouted a new one on the north side to connect La Bahia Presidio more directly to 𝗟𝗧𝗧. Both of these early mission ranches, however, were below the river. Mission Espada's ranch, doubtless the goat ranch, Las Cabras, had a good stone house with all necessary furniture and equipment to enable the cowboys and shepherds to live comfortably. It, like Barrero's ranch, possessed a distinctive branding iron. These hierros, or irons, were also noted by Fray Ortiz in the report of 1745. Unfortunately, the other ranches are not described in any detail. Concepcion's had all accommodations needed. To judge from the report of 1745, it was distant from the mission compound and farm, for which reason the stock could not be counted in Fray Ortiz's presence. He said that the mission had its own brand. Most likely the several houses occupied by ranch hands were mere yacales, or thatched huts, standing near the west bank of the Chibolo at the place called Paistil. Very little is known about San Juan's ranch, only that its flock of sheep skyrocketed from 300 in 1745 to 4,000 by 1756, while its cattle remained at around 900 head. These figures depending on which archive the report is drawn from. By 1762, Mission San Juan Capistrano's lands were not considered extensive enough to support all its cattle and horses, despite Captain Urrucha's statement 7 years earlier that it enjoyed more and better pastures than those of neighboring establishments. A branding iron is not mentioned in the report. It must also be remembered that this culture, especially the type enjoyed at Las Cabras by its newly converted Indian vaqueros, was essentially rustic, if not downright primitive. Such a lifestyle was not too drastically different from that of their neighbors in this remote province at the end of His Majesty's realm, the half-savage Spaniards of 𝗟𝗧𝗧.